The Scream. Let's talk about it. The Scream has been the bread and butter of horror movies since the dawn of cinema. But not just anyone can scream on screen. There's an art to doing it when the cameras are on. Having a good scream can put you on a fast track for movie superstardom. Having a bad one, well, you better hope they can fix it in post. No actor working today understands the importance of a good scream quite like Mia Goth. If you're watching this video, you probably know Mia for her many talents and barely their eyebrows. But for the rest of you, Mia's been in movies like Infinity Pool, A Cure for Wellness, and the 2018 remake of Suspiria. She's also the star of the Ty West X trilogy, where she played a porn star turned slaughterhouse survivor, and her most famous role, the trad wife, Technicolor psycho killer, Pearl. Some people will tell you she deserved an Oscar for that one. This month, Mia Goth returns to theaters for the third installment of the X trilogy, in the title role from MaXXXine. The new A24 movie finds Mia, as MaXXXine Minx, trading in adult entertainment for something even sleazier, the world of 1980s Hollywood. MaXXXine is sure to be one of A24's biggest releases of the year, and likely the biggest of Mia's career so far. But solidifying her as a box office draw is only part of what this movie should accomplish. MaXXXine is the capstone on a decade-plus filmography that's seen Mia transform from teen model to something even bigger, bolder, and louder. Hollywood's reigning scream queen. It's a crown with a history that's fascinating, bloody, often profitable, but sometimes very limiting. It includes B-movie icons and Oscar winners. How does Mia fit into this line of succession? To figure that out, we need to go all the way back to the beginning of movie history, to back before we could even hear the screams. Let's start with a definition, shall we? At its most basic level, a scream queen is an actress who's become well known for starring in horror movies, but there's some debate over the term. For example, Sigourney Weaver is something of a Rorschach test for the title. When you watch her play Ellen Ripley in Alien, you probably see a badass action star, but a lot of people, especially on the internet, have her at the top of the scream queen power rankings. Horror traditionalists, however, typically consider scream queens to be the actors who excel at playing the old damsel in distress, hence all the screaming. Some have earned the title for a single role, like Shelley Duvall in The Shining. Some have made hundreds of films and became icons to horror fans, even if your average moviegoer wouldn't recognize them. But all have made their voices heard when being chased by a bad guy with a knife, or a chainsaw, or an axe. Now, there are, of course, scream kings. But where action movies have long been anchored by roided-up dudes, horror movies are often led by young, attractive actresses. Maybe it's the mix of sex appeal and blood and guts. Maybe it's seeing the bloody beauty outwit the murderous beast. Maybe we just react more viscerally to the sound of a woman's shriek than a man's. But we want the stars of our horror films to be romantic, vulnerable, smart, and really powerful. In other words, they need to be able to do a lot more than just scream. But having a good one certainly helps. I mean, it's even a plot point in Brian De Palma's 1981 film Blowout. That's the one I showed you earlier, with the bad scream. In that movie, John Travolta plays a sound effects guy looking for the perfect scream to finish off a low-budget slasher flick.
All right, you know any good screamers?
I got a few ideas.
I bet you do.
Yeah.
He eventually did find a good one, though, small spoiler, he finds it in an unexpected way, and is absolutely horrifying. Now, the first Scream Queens weren't called Scream Queens, probably in part because they date back to the silent film era. You have Mary Philbin in The Phantom of the Opera, or German actress Greta Schroeder in movies like Nosferatu and The Lost Shadow. But even though you couldn't hear them, the sight of their screams helped bring the terror alive and make audiences shiver in their seats. As far as we can tell, the first person the press ever called a Scream Queen was Fay Wray. She's best known for the original King Kong in 1933. And who could forget Fay being held hostage, tied to two pillars, as the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood approaches, and she screams for her life. Decades later, Fay would say that she screamed for up to 8 hours a day while filming the movie. Then, after principal photography wrapped, she spent a week recording more screams for the filmmakers to use throughout. What you're hearing is a great actress capturing not only the sound of fear, but also her own exhaustion. Faye would also eventually become exhausted with the term Scream Queen itself. Her roles in the early 30s included not just King Kong, but other horror movies like The Most Dangerous Game, Dr. X, and Mystery of the Wax Museum. She began to worry about being typecast, worried that her best work would hold her back like those chains did to her King Kong character. But while Faye eventually made peace with her time in the clutches of King Kong, she never really made peace with the title Scream Queen. As she told an interviewer in 2003, quote, "I do not like it at all. Would you?" More on that later. While the 40s and 50s saw a handful of great actors like Evelyn Ankers and Hazel Court in movies like The Wolfman and The Curse of Frankenstein, those decades were a little light on the scares. You could blame that in part on the Haze Code, the set of censorship rules that governed Hollywood for 3 decades starting in the 30s. They required filmmakers to limit anything that lowered, quote, "the moral standards of those who see it." That meant no explicit sex and no gory violence. You can imagine the chilling effect that had on horror movies. It took some creativity to get around that. It took someone like this guy, Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, the man behind thrillers like Rebecca and Vertigo and North by Northwest. And most importantly for our purposes, the mastermind of this one. This is Janet Leigh, who screamed perhaps the most iconic scream in Hollywood history. It's from Psycho, as you already know, even if you've never seen the movie. Everything about the shower scene is perfect, from Bernard Herrmann's score, to the shadowy figure in the blood circling the drain, to the fact that Janet was sold to audiences as the star of the film, only to be killed off 47 minutes in. But what really pushes the terror over the top is Janet's scream. With the viewer unable to see much of the actual attack, we're left with only our ears and our imaginations. What comes out of Janet's mouth is as piercing as the killer's knife. And it was enough to make her horror movie royalty. Because even though she appeared in only 4 horror movies in her 6-decade career, she's still considered among the greatest scream queens ever. Janet Leigh wasn't the only scream queen of the 60s. You've probably heard of Bette Davis and Barbara Steele. But it wasn't until the 70s that horror movies really hit a golden age. We've now said goodbye to the Haze Code and hello to New Hollywood. That means a lot of risk-taking and a lot of sex, drugs, and violence. And while this is happening, the unbelievable success of the independent film Night of the Living Dead kicks off a horror renaissance. Before long, we're getting more intense and more unforgiving movies. And a lot of them had iconic female leads. Think Sandra Peabody in The Last House on the Left, a 14-year-old Linda Blair spitting pea soup and twisting her neck in The Exorcist, Sissy Spacek as both the victim and the monster in Carrie, and the list goes on. Marlene Clark, maybe the first black scream queen in Ganja and Hess, Olivia Hussey in the sorority slasher Black Christmas, and for my money, the scream that will forever ring in my ears, Marilyn Burns at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Seriously, the last 30 minutes is basically Marilyn shrieking at the top of her lungs while being chased by a surprisingly cardio-fit Leatherface. But when we're talking 70s horror icons and all-time scream queens, we're often talking one person, Jamie Lee Curtis, the star of Halloween. Jamie Lee Curtis is now considered one of the most successful actors ever. But back in the late 70s, she was something of a scream nepo baby. Her mom is none other than the ultimate scream queen herself, Janet Leigh. But Jamie Lee still had to read for her part in Halloween. And here's what director John Carpenter told Rotten Tomatoes about her 1978 audition.
We picked a scene in the script and she read it and she had had a quality about her. There was an innocence and yet a strength going on in there. And I really liked it.
So we cast her. And Jamie Lee channeled that innocence and strength into Laurie Strode, the buttoned-up heroine who went toe-to-toe with Michael Myers. Halloween would become not only one of the most successful horror movies of its time, but also one of the most successful independent films ever. A big part of that is because of Michael Myers, the manifestation of pure evil in coveralls and a William Shatner mask. But Jamie Lee's scrappiness and empathy made her maybe the most relatable scream queen yet. And maybe the most famous one too. Her name is synonymous with the idea of the scream queen, as the movie Scream reminded us back in 1996.
How come Jamie Lee Curtis is in all of these movies?
She's the Scream Queen.
Jamie Lee would go on to star in other horror films like Prom Night, The Fog, and Terror Train. But she's most famous for facing off with Michael Myers so many times. In the past 45 years, Jamie Lee has played Laurie Strode 7 times total. Most recently, she starred in 2022's Halloween Ends. But if history has taught us anything, it's that you better not take that title too literally. Ah, the 80s. The good stuff. Dee Wallace in Cujo, Barbara Crampton in Chopping Mall, From Beyond, and of course, Reanimator. Linnea Quigley in, well, everything. Seriously, Linnea may not be as famous as Linda Blair or Jamie Lee Curtis, but if we're going by counting stats, she's the Pete Rose of Scream Queens. Linnea has starred in more than 180 movies, and almost all of them have been horror, including a few with fantastic names like Sorority Babes and the Slimeball Bolorama, and Hollywood Chainsaw Hookers. I wonder if you can get FanDuel odds on that. But the 80s are probably best known for the explosion of franchises. Naturally, there's Halloween. And you also see the birth of the Friday the 13th series, which, let's not forget, made Jason's mother the villain long before the son ever donned the hockey mask. But the most enduring franchise scream queen of the 80s was Heather Langenkamp in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Heather played Nancy Thompson a few times. In the original Nightmare, then in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and finally, in a roundabout way, in the extremely meta 1994 film Wes Craven's New Nightmare. This is a character that upended a lot of what we expect from horror movie heroines. Where others were often simply reacting and just trying to make it out alive, Nancy was being, well, let's say, proactive. Studying books on booby traps and game planning her dreams to try to beat Freddy.
Well, what are you reading that for?
I'm into survival.
And where some scream queens fit neatly into good girl and bad girl tropes, Nancy was a schoolgirl in a pink sweater with a foul mouth.
Both come out, you whack the fucker, and we got him.
Look, it sucks to lose all your friends, but it sure does seem like Nancy took some sick satisfaction in taking down that asshole in a fedora. Yeah, she could scream, but Nancy was so much more than that. Heather made her the girl next door who doubled as the baddest dream warrior. And for a genre that was going more mainstream and getting younger, she was the prototype. You see her DNA in the 90s and early 2000s, in the movies geared toward the MTV generation. You know, the Final Destination or I Know What You Did Last Summer types. The kinds of movies that would star Sarah Michelle Gellar, one of the defining scream queens of the era. And maybe not coincidentally, you see a little of Heather and Nancy in Scream, which, like Nightmare, is directed by Wes Craven. The first Scream film from 1996 is among the most influential mainstream slashers ever. It's a meta-commentary, both a takedown of a genre that had grown stale and a tribute to everything that made it great. And while the most famous Scream in the movie came courtesy of Drew Barrymore, the enduring queen of Scream is Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, who showed us that to blow up a stereotype, you have to embody it first.
No, it's just, what's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
And yes, this being both a love letter and a critique, Sidney did those very things just a few moments later. For all the older millennials watching this video, Neve Campbell will always be the #1 Scream Queen. She's played Sidney 5 times in the past 3 decades, and she'll reportedly do so once again in Scream 7. And each time, she's embodied resilience and strength, brains and beauty. The movies and Sidney became so adored that even a loving spoof like Scary Movie turned into a classic in its own right. Now, there have been plenty of great Scream Queens since Ghostface first chased Sidney up those stairs. The list includes actresses like Naomi Watts, who starred in Mulholland Drive, The Ring, and the Funny Games remake. Notably, she even took on the Fay Wray role in the 2005 King Kong. The list also includes people like Shawnee Smith, Jane Levy, Anya Taylor-Joy, Vera Farmiga, and especially Samara Weaving, who may have the best pure scream of anyone that we've mentioned outside of Marilyn Burns. There have also been plenty of great one-off performances. I'm thinking Lupita Nyong'o in Us, and Toni Collette in Hereditary. Toni's performance was so great, you may lose your head over it. But when we're talking contemporary scream queens, in my humble opinion, there's one name and one name only: Mia Goth. This isn't any disrespect to Jenna Ortega, who starred alongside Mia in the movie X, and who played Tara in the past 2 Scream movies. And it's especially no disrespect to Maika Monroe. She starred in one of the best horror movies of the 2010s with It Follows, and she'll also be the lead of the heavily anticipated Longlegs, which also hits theaters in July. But over the past decade, Mia has put together a resume that's made her a cult icon and put her on the precipice of something so much bigger. She got her start in the 2013 Lars von Trier film Nymphomaniac, which is not a horror movie, but also not a horror movie. From there, she goes on to supporting roles in horror films like Marrowbone and A Cure for Wellness, and then the 2018 remake of Suspiria and Claire Denis' heady thriller about convicts in space, High Life. Mia makes the most of her relatively limited screen time. She brings a haunted child's energy to some of these parts and a manic villain's to others. And you'd be hard-pressed to find someone better at pulling off facial expressions, even with those extremely faint eyebrows. But all of her genius always came in glimpses. It wasn't until director Ty West came along that someone was able to tap into her full potential. The movie X, released in 2022, is fascinating. Like Scream, it's a tribute to genre films. But unlike Scream, one of those genres is pornography. But of course, it's also an homage to slasher flicks, which had once again fallen out of favor in the 2010s as quote-unquote elevated horror became popular studio jargon. But there's not much about X that's all that elevated. It's a blood and guts gore fest equally indebted to Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Debbie Does Dallas. Spoiler coming for anyone who hasn't watched X. It features one of the best dual performances you'll ever see in a horror movie, courtesy of Mia.
I will not accept a life I do not deserve.
That's Mia playing both Maxine Minx and an elderly Pearl. It's a commentary on chasing stardom, coming of age, and aging out. Mainly though, it's just really cool. A showcase of Mia's versatility, that she can play the hunter and the hunted. She doubled down on all that in the prequel to X, the movie Pearl, where she plays a younger version of the title role. The film is plenty gory, but it's also a tribute to old Hollywood in films like The Wizard of Oz and Mary Poppins. Sure, we see seeds of her murderous tendencies, but the most stunning moments involve Mia dancing in her blood-red dress or reciting a quiet 8-minute monologue that will have you unexpectedly empathizing with her.
Truth is, I'm not really a good person.
And forget the blood-curdling screams. The most unsettling moments of Pearl may be the silent final ones, as Mia holds a smile more disturbing than anything I've ever seen as tears stream down her face. For all of her excellent work the past decade, Pearl is the movie that had people screaming in their own right that Mia deserved an Academy Award. There's a reason why MaXXXine is one of the most anticipated movies of the year, the rare slasher flick in 2024 with blockbuster potential. But box office prospects aside, it makes me wonder, is all this a good thing for Mia long term? We know that history has not always been kind to our Scream Queens. Remember that Fay Wray hated the term, and even Jamie Lee Curtis had to go make a comedy like Trading Places before people took her seriously. There's a reason why Barbara Crampton, the star of Chopping Mall and Reanimator, has made it somewhat of a mission to kill off the phrase Scream Queen. Here's Barbara talking about it with YouTuber Spooky Astronauts back in 2021.
But I find the term to be kind of old-fashioned and antiquated. It sounds like a cheap term for the worthy work that women do.
She's not wrong per se. While I believe most fans use the phrase affectionately, as a celebration of sometimes great acting and sometimes campy brilliance, the word Scream Queen can feel a little limiting. They're also maybe a tad misogynistic, as though they imply the actors aren't much more than the busty women running up the flight of stairs who Sidney Prescott mocked. And, let's face it, for all the legitimately excellent craft that has gone into these roles, the Oscars aren't exactly bending over backwards to recognize them. But we've seen a lot of change since Janet Leigh first turned on that shower. While people like Jamie Lee and Fay Wray had to leave the genre to level up, it's a little bit different for Mia Goth. She can build an A-list career out of making horror movies almost exclusively. That's partly because of studios like A24 and Neon. They've widened the scope of what we consider quote-unquote horror, and in the process, they've made films that critics would have hated even 20 years ago into high art. That shift is also partly the result of how fractured and niche our media consumption has gotten the past 2 decades. That it's now better to play to a rabid, devoted audience than it is to try to be all things to all moviegoers. But Mia's success is also a testament to her work in the genre, her range and ability to find something human in her characters, even at their most monstrous. Consider the depth she brought to High Life, or the theatrics of Pearl.
No, I'm a star! Please, I'm a star!
Or the menace and seductiveness she exuded throughout Infinity Pool. And you see an actor with no limitations, with nothing stopping her from being every bit the star that Pearl wanted to be. It's interesting then that MaXXXine, like its predecessor X, is a self-referential movie about genre work. But in the case of MaXXXine, it's also about trying to transcend those genres. And yes, that includes adult entertainment, but if you've seen the trailer for MaXXXine, you know that also includes slasher flicks.
MaXXXine fucking minx!
It's very meta in the context of the film. But for Mia herself, it's not about getting a start in horror and moving on to something else. It's about building something bigger within it. Because after MaXXXine, her next planned role is in Guillermo del Toro's remake of Frankenstein, where she'll take on the legendary role of the bride. And after that, there's rumblings that Ty West may make a 4th installment of the X series. It would certainly seem that Mia has no plans to step down from her throne. But one thing's for certain, she won't be the final girl. There will be someone else coming to snatch the crown. Maybe it'll be Lily Rose Depp after Nosferatu, or maybe Sydney Sweeney found a new religion with Immaculate. Or maybe it'll be an actor that we don't even know yet, ready to shred her vocal cords to make sure her name rings out. But either way, when the next Scream Queen arrives, you may want to cover your ears. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Jack Sanders for editing. Special thanks go to Nicole Ohanessian, Corey McConnell, Dan Comer, and Vikram Patel. Remember to like and subscribe, and feel free to sound off in the comments. Who did we miss? Who will be the next Scream Queens? Until next time, I'm Justin Sayles.